Ethelred, or Ethelred the Unready as he came to be known, was born in around 966. His father was Edgar, who was around 23 at the time of his son's birth. At the time of his birth, his father had been King of England for around 7 years. When Ethelred was about 9 years old, his father, King Edgar, known as Edgar the Peaceful, died. Ethelred's older half-brother Edward then reigned as king until March 978, when he was brutally murdered. Consequently, Ethelred was crowned king. He would rule until 1013, and then again until 1016, roughly from when he was 12 years old until his late 40s. At the start of his life, it was most likely assumed or hoped that, like some of his predecessors, his father King Edgar and his grandfather Edmund, Ethelred's reign would only end with his death, followed by the succession of his eldest son. Only it didn't end up that way. Instead, in the remaining years of his life, his son and successor died, and he was dethroned and chased out of England by the King of Norway. As a consequence of all that, we don't just know him as King Ethelred. The history books know him as Ethelred the Unready. Now, Unready shouldn't be interpreted as we would, that when he came to the throne he wasn't ready to be king, though given that he was only about 12 years old when he was crowned, this would be a fair assumption. In Old English, the word red means counsel or advice, though it can also be interpreted as prepared. Meanwhile, the Ethel in his name is another Old English word meaning noble. So Ethelred's birth name itself roughly translates as nobly advised or nobly prepared. Unready, on the other hand, means the very opposite, unadvised or badly advised. So in a sense, his historical name is kind of a joke, a play on his actual name. His name could be roughly interpreted as well-advised the badly advised, or, at a stretch, well-prepared the badly prepared. Let's look at where he sits within our kings and queens timeline. Here he is. As mentioned, Ethelred was born in around 966. At the time of his birth, his father, King Edgar, had been on the English throne for around 6 years. His mother Elfrith was King Edgar's second wife, and he had an older half-brother called Edward from Edgar's first marriage. Powerful opposing factions in England at the time of Edgar's death disagreed on which son should be made king, Edward or Ethelred, the son of England's queen. In the end, the crown was awarded to the eldest son, Edward, who was only about 12 at the time. Poor Edward was murdered less than 3 years into his reign, and Ethelred ascended to the throne. You can learn more about Edward and King Edgar by watching our previous videos. Ethelred's reign was defined by his battles and bad relations with invading Danish forces. In 927, King Ethelstan had finally defeated the last Danish stronghold of York and had united England under one king. Though the Danes repeatedly tried to regain a foothold, they had been held at bay over the ensuing decades. Ethelred's father, King Edgar, had achieved this partly because he employed professional armies to police the north, while a large navy guarded the shores from Viking raids. Not long after young Ethelred took over, though, the Viking Danes stepped up their attempts and started to raid the English coastline again. In 991, a large Danish fleet made landfall in Essex, and a large-scale battle at Malden ensued. In spite of brave resistance, the Danes were victorious. Instead of trying to defeat the Viking raiders by fighting them, Ethelred seems to have taken the decision to try and bribe the invaders with a £10,000 tribute. However, rather than buying peace, this appears to have led to more demands from the Vikings, who extracted a further £22,000 in gold and silver from the king. These raids continued throughout the late 990s, and again, in 1002, Ethelred tried to buy peace with a £24,000 tribute to the raiders. In 1007, he handed over £36,000 of gold and silver. Then in 1009, another Danish army invaded, which was eventually bought off with a peace bribe of £48,000. In the middle of all this, things went from bad to worse. It was perhaps bad enough that the raiders were being paid off, which seemed to have the effect of simply encouraging them more. But in 1002, Ethelred made the fateful decision of ordering the massacre of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November. Though the tributes he paid meant Ethelred's kingdom was almost £150,000 lighter, a fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds in today's money, with still no guarantee of peace, the St. Brice's Day massacre perhaps remains the most fateful decision Ethelred made. Many of the Danes slaughtered had been in England for generations and would possibly have considered themselves English. So, from the outside, it looks like Ethelred paid off the Viking invaders rather than fighting them, then had his men run their swords through innocent, unarmed Danes living within England. One of the victims of this massacre was a Scandinavian noblewoman called Gunhilda, who had married an English ealdorman. Gunhilda also happened to be the little sister of a man called Sweyn Forkbeard, who was the king of Norway. Possibly in a fit of revenge, Sweyn launched a series of attacks on England, and in 1013 launched an all-out invasion with the aim of conquering England and placing himself on the throne. And this is exactly what he did. Ethelred was forced to abandon his kingdom and sought shelter in Normandy. Meanwhile, in England, Sweyn was crowned king on Christmas Day, 1013. Ethelred had been able to seek shelter in Normandy because in 1002 he married Emma, the sister of Richard II, the Duke of Normandy, a marriage that produced another future king, Edward the Confessor. Luckily for Ethelred, Sweyn died just over 1 month later, and Ethelred returned to England and was crowned again. In a late attempt to prevent being deposed again, Ethelred went to battle against Sweyn's son Canute and drove him from England. Ethelred died in 1016 and was buried in Old St. Paul's Cathedral. His tomb was destroyed exactly 650 years later during the Great Fire of London in 1666. Before we leave him, let's take one last look at why Ethelred's reputation is so poor. The first time his name was recorded with the epithet the Unready was in the 1180s, more than a century after the Norman invasion of 1066. By that time, things may well have settled down somewhat, but perhaps even then, people were thinking about what might have been had Ethelred played his cards differently. It's possible to imagine a world where Ethelred had instead fought the Danish invaders rather than paying them off, and also had not ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002. In that case, it's possible the Norman invasion might never have happened, and maybe the people of the 1180s had considered this too. The Norman invasion was an absolutely pivotal moment and changed the course of English and world history forever. The invasion was a disaster for the established rulers of England, who were either killed or thrown off their land. Even the lower classes suffered from the Norman invaders, who killed innocent people they suspected of resisting their takeover. As we'll find out in a later video, this was especially so in Northumbria, where William's men killed ordinary folk for simply living there and salted their farmland, causing crop failures and famine. But the Norman invasion has much wider historical implications. Without it and William the Conqueror, the history of England and potentially the world could have been completely different. Not only would there be no Queen Elizabeth II, who is in fact the 24th great-granddaughter of William the Conqueror, England would never have had the kings and queens that came after him, especially Henry VIII, the 12th great-grandson of William the Conqueror. With no Henry VIII, there would have potentially been no split with Rome in the 1500s, no Church of England, and no dissolution of the monasteries. Then, potentially, there would have been no Puritans setting off for New England on the Mayflower in the 1600s, and so, well, no Thanksgiving, and who knows what else. It's a long chain of events that starts with King Ethelred, and perhaps one of the reasons he has such a poor reputation is that the seeds of the Norman invasion seem to have been sown by the decisions he made. Let's imagine Ethelred had never ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre. In this scenario, Gunhilda is not slaughtered, and so her brother, Sweyn Forkbeard, is not provoked into launching his revenge. As a consequence, Sweyn is never made King of England. Later, when he dies, his son Canute has no claim to inherit the English throne, and he simply remains a prince, the second son of the King of Norway. Also in this scenario, Sweyn doesn't exile Ethelred to Normandy, and he remains king uninterrupted till his death. As a consequence, perhaps, he doesn't feel the need to tie himself politically through marriage to the House of Normandy by marrying Emma, the Duke of Normandy's sister. Though it's perfectly possible this marriage and Sweyn's invasion would have taken place anyway, let's imagine it didn't. William the Conqueror's claim to the English throne in 1066 was absolutely tied to Ethelred's marriage to Emma. William the Conqueror was the grandson of Richard II, the Duke of Normandy. Ethelred's new wife Emma, the Queen of England, was therefore William's great-aunt. Without this marriage, not only does William have no link to the English throne, Emma and Ethelred's son, Edward the Confessor, is never born. And so William is never able to claim that Edward promised him the English throne on his deathbed. Again, it's perfectly possible the Norman invasion might have happened anyway, but the marriage did perhaps give William a reason to launch his conquest in the first place, and ultimately it gave him some legitimacy when he took over. In our fantasy scenario, Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside is made king, which is what happened anyway. But it's also possible that Edmund Ironside died young, in his 20s, precisely because of the turmoil in England. There are theories he either died of battle wounds or was murdered by a rival faction that supported Sweyn's son, Canute, as king. Instead of being murdered, in our fantasy history, Edmund rules as King of England until the 1040s. He is succeeded by his son, King Edward, who reigns until the late 1050s. Finally, Edgar Atheling reigns as King of England from 1057, crowned when he is 5, until his death in 1125. In the real world, Edgar Atheling did live until the year 1125. But of course he was never crowned King of England, and instead had no choice but to pay tribute to William I as the new king. It's quite possible then that instead of a timeline where all the kings and queens after 1066 are descendants of William the Conqueror, famous kings and queens such as Richard the Lionheart, Henry V, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Charles I, Queen Victoria, and our current Queen, Elizabeth II, would never have existed. Instead, we would be looking at a completely different set of kings and queens, possibly ones descended from the House of Wessex. A completely different set of faces, a completely different set of historical events. But that wasn't to be. In our next video, we'll be taking a closer look at Sweyn Forkbeard, who reigned as King of England for just 41 days. Please remember to hit the subscribe button below to receive an alert when we upload our next video. You can also help us make these videos by supporting us on Patreon, using the link below.